And I think we'll get started now. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining. It should be a really interesting discussion today. My name is Mary Abdo. I am the Managing Director for CEI based in our Singapore office. It's a Center for Evidence and Implementation. We are a co-host of the Evidence and Implementation Summit. And this is the first in our virtual series of webinars in this next iteration of this series. So we had a really successful series in the run-up to our 2021 Evidence and Implementation Summit, about 6 webinars that you can access on the Evidence and Implementation Summit website. And we expect to be holding one every 2 to 2.5 months in the run-up to the next summit, which will be in 2023, currently slated for October, though watch that date. And so we're really excited today to be diving into this topic. For those of us who work in the evidence and implementation sector, this is a particularly important and interesting topic, one that we do think about quite a lot in our identity at CEI as an evidence intermediary ourselves. And so really the framing for this event is that we know that there is a gap between research and practice. We know that that gap in some sectors can be as large as 17 years. That's known in clinical practice as the bench to bedside gap. And so what is it doing that we are waiting for 17 years for that evidence of things that we know could change people's lives today to make their way into routine practice? And we see the What Works centers and other kinds of evidence intermediaries and evidence repositories moving into the space to try and accelerate that translation of research into practice. Now that we're a good decade or so into the movement for What Works centers, it's really time that we ask what works for what works, what helps us to accelerate that research into practice from the perspective of institutions tasked with that activity. So today we're really excited to be joined by 2 guest speakers, as well as by our own Robin Milden from the Center for Evidence and Implementation. Our guests are Dr. Jenny Donovan, who's CEO at the Australian Education Research Organisation, Australia's Evidence Centre for Education, and John Yates, the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund in the UK. So the format for this event is that we'll be looking at having about 40 to 45 minutes of panel discussion, and then about 15 to 20 minutes with a Q&A based on questions that our audience brings up. And so what we'd love to have you do, starting really as early as you can in this conversation, is to start popping any questions you have into the chat, and we will get to as many of those as we can and pick up on some key themes in the Q&A. And so without further ado, we'll get started by going to some introductions from our panelists. I'm going to stop sharing. And we hopefully in just a minute, you'll see the 4 of us on screen. We'll look to our lovely tech support to make that possible. But let me just quickly ask for the first, say, 5 to 7 minutes, we'll be for each of our panelists, we'll be going to them to ask them to introduce themselves, a little bit about their work and their institutions, and to address this question of what works for what works to get us started. So I'm going to start by turning to Dr. Jenny Donovan. And so Jenny, you've been in post at Arrow for about 1 year now, so coming up on about a year in that CEO role at Arrow. Really, what are the top 3 practical things that you have learned in the first year about what works for what works? How would you reflect on that question? And we'd love to hear a little bit about Arrow.
Thanks, Mary. I'm always happy to talk about Arrow. I might begin, if you don't mind, just by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm living and working on here in Sydney, in Australia, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present, and any Aboriginal people who might be with us online today. Arrow has just turned 1 year old. We're quite new, but in fact, I think our trajectory is exactly what you were describing earlier. There's been about 10 years of this What Works movement. So we've come in on the crest of this slow forming wave of enthusiasm for evidence in education. In 2012, so a decade ago, I set up the Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation in the New South Wales Department of Education, that was all about trying to understand more about what works in education and making sure that people knew about it, and doing our best to make sure that people acted on the good information that we had available to them. It was around the same time that the UK was setting up the evidence in the Education Endowment Foundation, and other similar things were happening around the world. So it's taken a decade for Australia to decide what we were doing in New South Wales there would be a good thing for the whole country. And the nature of our particular system is we have 9 education ministers in this fairly small populationed country, and they all had to agree that they all wanted a National Evidence Institute. ERO had to be agreed by consensus. All of them had to say, yes, we want this, and yes, we will put some funding towards it, and it will all be wonderful. Good on them, they did, they got there, and now we're here. We've got an ambitious kind of vision for what we want to do, that we want Australia to achieve excellence and equity in education outcomes for all children and young people through the effective use of evidence. And to achieve that ambition, we've got 3 areas of activity that we've identified. One is about helping to build the evidence base, understanding what works in the first instance, undertaking research if we need to, and there's certainly some gaps in our evidence base at the moment. The second part is the piece about really publishing, making evidence available, translating, synthesizing, putting what we know about what works out there so that practitioners and policymakers in education can access it and know what it is that they should be doing in their practice. And the third part is the trickiest part, and it's the real focus of this conversation. It's about how do we encourage the adoption and implementation of effective practice. So it's one thing to know that some things work better to improve learning outcomes. It's quite another to understand whether or not those practices are the things that teachers are actually deploying in their classrooms. So when we were being set up, I was dwelling on this a lot and thinking about the fact that the truth is, evidence about what works best in education doesn't improve student learning. On its own, evidence doesn't change anything. Having a beautiful website and glossy publications won't shift the dial on student learning. Another thing...
Sorry, Jenny, just to interrupt you. I'm going to ask the audience to go to speaker view. Apparently, we're having a little bit of tech issue. We're supposed to be seeing all speakers on the same screen at once. It's not happening. So if you'd like to see Jenny's beautiful face, please go to speaker view. And Jenny, sorry for the interruption.
It's really not a beautiful face. You know, that photo that you flashed, it's really false advertising. It's COVID grey that I'm rocking here. The other thing is that just because we now have an evidence institute called ERO doesn't mean that we are all suddenly evidence-based. There is real risk with what we've created here, that the ministers who set us up and funded us are at risk of saying, good on us, job done, we're now evidence-based. And of course, there is so much more that needs to be done to actually implement evidence in practice. And the other thing that was really weighing on me was, in 5 years' time, if we look at, you know, PISA or any of those measures of student learning outcomes and realise that Australia hasn't leapt to the top and taken over the whole world in terms of the evidence of learning for our students, then there's a real risk that people are going to turn around and say, well, ERO, you've been here for 5 years and you were meant to improve student learning outcomes. So what's the story? So I've really been thinking about how are we going to make sure that what we're doing is different to what's gone before. There's a track record of what works, agencies, centres, organisations, having all sorts of terrific insights and information about what works, but not actually landing it so that you see improvement. You know, what's the connection between knowing what to do and actually making sure it gets done and improvement is the result? Which is really the reason why I came to talk to CEI, because I wanted, before we got too far into this exercise, to understand better what's happened in other places that have attempted similar things, and what are the kind of landmines that we could avoid and mistakes we could avert, and what are the learnings that we can get from them so that Aero can actually have the kind of impact that we want it to have sooner. Is that a reasonable overview of what we're doing? I don't want to talk too long.
No, that's great. Thank you for the introduction. There's a lot of meat there that we can start getting into. And I'm just going to throw to John. That's some great food for thought, Jenny. John, maybe picking up on some of the themes that Jenny's talked about, and also reflecting on your 2.5 years in your role at Youth Endowment Fund. It'd be great to hear an introduction to you, to the work that you're doing, and any initial reactions you have on that question of what works for what works.
Thanks, Mary, and very kind of you to invite me. The Youth Endowment Fund, which I lead, is a £200 million endowment based in the UK, focused on youth violence, so violence committed by young people, with a vision that no child should be involved in violence, which most people can get behind quite easily, but then a mission to try and find what works, and then build a movement to put it into practice. And what we continually say internally and externally is the finding what works is the easy bit. The building the movement to put it into practice is the hard bit. And you know, the default path for this this endowment will be to do a really decent job on what works and change absolutely nothing at all. And so what we have to do is find a way to get off that path. And that's absolutely non-trivial. And not at all straightforward or easy. And I say that because I know how hard it is to change my own practice. So, you know, I believed for about a decade that I probably should take regular exercise before I actually took regular exercise. You know, I didn't have a lack of evidence to tell me it was a good idea. I didn't have a lack of personal incentive to do so. I didn't have a lack of agency to do so. I had everything I needed, you know, pretty much in the, you know, combi model. I had everything to do it, didn't do it. And so, you know, I think we start from a point that actually change is very tricky and unlikely to occur. So what do we do about it? Now, we're 2.5 years in, we're still quite young. So I'm talking about things we're going to need to execute on mostly here, rather than things I'm saying we have executed on. I think there's 3 key things that have been on my mind that we're trying to focus on. The first is probably the easiest, which is ease of information. So making the information as accessible as possible, as in, can the layperson read it and understand it? You know, it's the curse of knowledge, as some of you will know. It's really hard to get outside of your own language and your own way of talking and realize that the average practitioner may well have no idea what you're talking about. And so trying to find a way to keep things not simplistic, but as simple and accessible as possible. And part of that for us is what we call the YEF toolkit, which is a very simple online summary of what we know about what works. Then the second, which is I think the hardest bit, is hearts and minds. You know, how, and particular emphasis of hearts. You know, how do you get people to sort of feel a desire to act on this stuff with a general view that they won't do it just because the evidence says so? And there's 3 things in there that we really try and focus on with a view that if we can hit all 3, we've got a shot. So one is, who are the gatekeepers? So, you know, who are the people in positions of power and authority? And how do we get them positively disposed towards what we're trying to do and warm towards what we're doing? And so at the heart of that, youth violence cuts across, I suspect the same in most countries, cuts across a number of government ministries here. Of course, it affects the police, but it's also about schools, it's also about housing, it's also about health. So actually for us to have warm, regular, repeating relationships with ministers is really important. And to make sure those are just constant chats. They're not just, we're coming because we want something. And for those conversations to be open to, what would you like us to look at? I think sometimes there can be a tendency to want to be purer than pure. Whereas I spent a bit of time in the political system, I think trying to give politicians their chance to influence, even if we don't have to, is actually really valuable, because it gives them a purchase and an ownership and a warmth. So those in power. The second then is, for any discrete area that you're trying to make change happen, we try to build a coalition. So again, the problem with youth violence, slightly different from education, I'd say here, is just the breadth of the solution space, a horrible bit of jargon, but we can be looking at one point at diversion from the criminal justice system, so kids who get arrested and what happens. At another point, we can be looking at absence from school. Those are completely different audiences for change. And so for us to build a coalition, and that group to have purchase and power over the guidance we write is really important to us. And for that coalition to feel they own what we're doing and what we're producing. Now that might mean what we produce is less good than if we'd done it ourselves. But we think that trade-off is really worth it, or going to be worth it. Again, we're still a work in progress, because if you make the cake yourself, you're more likely to want to eat it. And then finally, and this is the bit we've thought through the least so far, is how do we engage the mass of practitioners and activists in what we do? And so, we have teachers, we have police, we have youth workers, we have social workers. There's a lot of practitioners in our space. And what we want to try and find a way to do is to avoid just passively giving them information. How do we engage them, either to help them do their own research, or to get them to share knowledge with each other, or by funding some of them to do great work, but with a recognition that we're going to also train them on evidence at the same time. And so trying to build that sort of individualist movement becomes really important to us. So those are the three bits around hearts and minds. Those empower the coalitions and then the individuals. And then the final bit is, after ease of information, hearts, and then the third bit is don't rule out mandation. And so, I was struck, the Home Office, who are sort of oversee the police here, were keen to mandate that certain state bodies had to follow our guidance. And there was some internal reluctance in my team about this, which I would sort of say was, but we don't know 100% we're right. My previous job was, one of my previous jobs was an advisor to a cabinet minister here. You never know you're 100% right. Like, decisions are based on not knowing. And so for me, a degree of mandation on the best available evidence is not a bad idea, as long as it's not beyond a certain level. And so those are the three that we've tried to really focus on, but so much to learn and work out as we do it.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jenny and John, for really brilliant introductions. Robin, I'm going to throw to you for a quick introduction to you and to CEI, and any response you have to these comments that have been made so far.
Thanks, Mary. I won't say too much about CEI because I want to keep the flow of but I'm Robin Milden. I'm the Executive Director for the Centre for Evidence and Implementation. And I'm just going to try and build on a little bit of what both Jenny and John said. And I've also eyed off a couple of really juicy things in the chat there, which I'm pretty happy to respond to. And I also want to acknowledge we have a lot of friends in the audience. I can see you all coming in. Hi, gang. Look, we don't have any time to waste. So yes, evidence, to build on your point, John, getting the evidence is the easy bit. That's true and difficult all at the same time, because context really matters. And sometimes the evidence base, research evidence base, and I'm doing that on purpose, that we have to draw on is from a particular place and context. And that could happen locally in the UK or in Australia, or it could happen globally. So I would count Singapore as a place where we really need to take that into account. The hard thing is, how do we work with evidence that's actionable from the beginning, right? That's usable, that's doable, that is understandable, and that we can build implementation infrastructure around. So hearts and mind for sure. Champions was mentioned there, which is there's really nice research in the evidence base about engaging champions and how effective that is. A lot of you in this webinar would understand the importance and the increasing importance on knowledge brokers and the evidence around how to be an effective knowledge broker. But also that is influenced by context. So in some really cool studies, it's been shown that knowledge brokers no matter how good they are, were unnecessary, because that setting or that context could get on with using that evidence, could get on with adapting it and focusing on it. And some contexts really do benefit from sort of champions and knowledge broking activity that has been done in a particular skilled way. And one of the things I enjoy so much about our work that we do with the various What Works centers now, and including Aero, is really thinking about from the beginning, once we've built the websites, once we've built the tip sheets, once we've built then what? Then what? And maybe thinking about implementation right from the start and using some data to really understand of the things that we are sharing, disseminating, working with, have we had any uptake at all right from the beginning, not waiting until we've found some momentum. And I think including, and Jenny and John have referenced this, including practitioners, the people that will be using the evidence in that, also the people that will be thinking about making policy with that evidence, thinking about what researchers say are the gaps. Often it's easier to publish things that we know than to publish things we don't know, right? Or to publish things that have been shown not to work. So for as long as I've been around, people have been talking about the secret journal that publishes all the things that didn't work, that no one's been able to start or get moving. And so it's thinking about from the beginning, particularly when we're talking about working alongside, working with very vulnerable people, whether it be in the education setting, whether it be in the health, mental health, how can we combine this evidence intermediary, what works movement with thinking about and focusing actively on implementation right from the start, and maybe being brave and doing both at the same time. And that requires being able to set up kind of connections on the ground. That requires being able to understand what good data is. I often talk about with implementation, we sort of want to answer three things. We want to understand, are we reaching the people that children, families, or people that we want to? And that's often quite an implementation barrier itself, is reach. Are we implementing in a way that we thought we would be, whether that's to some particular plan or whether that's via clinical guidelines? And are we getting the outcomes that we thought we would be getting based on what that evidence says? And doing that right from the start, really pragmatic. Russ Glasgow in the US does these very nice papers, I encourage you to look it up, around pragmatic thinking around measurement. And he just does some no-brainer points. Like when you're thinking about how to measure something, engage stakeholders that will have to use that data in whether or not that is meaningful measurement to them. Be thinking about reliability and validity of the tools from the beginning. So I think if we to think about trying to bridge that gap and accelerate the effectiveness that we all are trying to have, I think it's worth saying we can sort of ramp the activity up around implementation from the get-go. And the last thing I'll say is there's a great question from Christopher, who's at the OECD, and yes, there is differences by sector for sure. So Chris is asking, with the 17-year comment that Mary started with, do we see differences by sector across health, education, social policy? And yes, you do. We see some, if COVID's a perfect example, whoa, the acceleration of implementation with COVID, my goodness. Like, didn't that just break down a whole lot of myths that this takes some time, right? When we really put our implementation back into it. And sometimes it can take a little longer. So I would say early childhood education is one where we are not, there is a lot of good evidence about how we can really improve outcomes for kids now. We are taking a little too long to get that into business as usual in the various early childhood sectors. And that's a really important time for prevention work. That's a really important time for development work with kids. So there are definitely differences. But I'll stop there. I think I'm just trying to build a little bit on that, and I'll keep a little eye on the questions, Mary, to help out.
That's great. Yeah, and I would just, for those who may have entered a little bit late, please do put it on a speaker view in your upper right-hand corner when you look at view, put it on speaker view so you see whoever is talking, and also please start adding your questions into the chat. We'll be saving some good time to address those questions, but as you can see, we'll start picking them up as we go. So I suppose this does, Robin, building on what you've said a little bit, I do think it would be useful to talk about maybe what some of the challenges have been for the What Works movement in terms of realizing its potential. and really accelerating the evidence into action. I might throw to John to start us off. John, in particular, you mentioned a few strategies, kind of a few pillars of how you think about your work and accelerating that evidence to practice. And to kind of query what you think some of the challenges are you're trying to overcome, what challenges you may have encountered in trying to leverage those tools.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I mean, a few immediate thoughts. I mean, some of this has already been touched on. I mean, the first one is who. You know, who actually holds the power to make the change happen. And definitely in the UK, if you're trying to say, for example, make a change to the way in which exclusion policy works, so children being excluded from schools, which is a correlate of youth violence, a complicated one, who exactly you need to influence is not obvious. So working out, is it the teachers, is it the head teachers, is it the local authority who oversee the school, is it we have effectively a system of publicly funded, privately run schools. So is it the chains that run those schools? You know, power is very. Is it the ministers? Which ministers? So you know, one problem you've got is who exactly do you need to bring on board? The second, I think, is then it's not good enough just to affect those people. Who are they listening to? So who's actually influencing them? And how do you actually get reach into those group of people? So that's sort of a broader sense of who. Second is language. So the way in which, again, in my space, the way in which police will talk about something like what we would call stop and search, what the Americans would call stop and frisk, I think, is very different, obviously, from the way youth workers would talk about it. So actually thinking about language is colossally important, and trying to make sure you're actually engaging with the conversation the particular sector is having. And then the third is just the force of inertia. And I think there's a slight tendency for people who those of us who are doing the evidence work to think, why aren't they changing? Why aren't they changing? But people are really busy. And I think we sometimes struggle to put ourselves in people's shoes and understand, you know, why and when do people change their practice? You know, if someone built a what work centre for what work centres and told me what to do, am I immediately jumping to do it? No, I've got other things to worry about. I've got the pay review to think about. And so I think trying to empathise and understand. The thing I found most useful in a lot of this, and I think it's Jonathan Haidt who came up with this originally, is just the model of why does inertia actually happen? Why does change actually happen? And he uses the rider and the elephant, which some of you would have heard of. That, you know, actually the way we make decisions is like a small human being sitting on an elephant. And so that the rider is your sort of rational bit of your brain engaging with the evidence, but the elephant is the powerful force that actually moves you, which is your emotions. If you genuinely want to start running, you've got to do more than the head knowledge. You've got to somehow engage the heart. And then the path the elephant goes across has to be wide enough for an elephant. And so you've got to make the path as easy as possible. So what are the barriers that are in the way? And often you can engage, say, for example, teachers and head teachers, but the barriers to what they want to implement are still in the way. And so you then got to think, well, how are you going to do that? And a lot of that stuff you're not necessarily going to find in the academic literature. You're going to find through listening and talking and spending time with people. And so it sometimes just requires us to play a slightly different game than we might be used to.
Some great insights in there, John. Thank you. Jenny, it would be really interesting to hear from you about what you think may be some of the barriers, either that you've observed over the last year in the role or that you anticipate based on what you understand of the What Works movement to making that change happen, to seeing evidence get into practice.
One of the big barriers for us is the site for the change that we want to see happen is in the classroom. So the primary audience is teachers. And teachers are not sitting around on their hands, tapping their fingers, waiting for us to bestow gems of wisdom on them. They're actually incredibly busy. They are every day trying to figure out the right things to be doing in their classrooms. They're going to Pinterest, they're going to Google, they're looking at all sorts of places for information about the way they can be doing the work that they do. And a real risk for us, a challenge for us has been to land on the landscape here and avoid the perception that we're here to make their lives even harder. We're just going to add to the burden. We're going to tell them what they've been getting wrong, and we're going to tell them how they've got to change. So the thing that we've learned is that we need to understand the environment that what we're doing is going to be landing in, and we've got to figure out, therefore, the best ways for implementation to happen, the messaging that we need to use, the fact that a lot of what we do, we've got a lot of teachers on our staff. We've got a lot of people who really understand what it is to be working in a school or an early childhood setting, and doing the job that you've got to do, even before you start contemplating changing. The other aspect that we're understanding is there's a big issue around the notion of de-implementation. For everything that we want a teacher to consider doing differently, it usually means we want them to abandon doing something that really doesn't work, that isn't going to be achieving the impact that they might expect. And that analogy that you've used about the 17 years between clinical trials and broad practice, there's another one that I use sometimes, which is about how do we stop people putting butter on burns? You know, we know that butter on burns is not the way to go. It was quite early on that the clinical trials said actually cool running water is the thing to do. But in teaching, and I'm using it metaphorically, I'm not accusing any teacher of harming any child, there's still a tendency to go with what is habit, what might have been part of your training, and the training in initial teacher education has not been great over an extensive period. And it's often intuition, a sense that, look, I've done this before and it worked okay. So we've got to carve out a space in all of that where we can take a message about change to teachers. We can't sit back and wait for them to find us on a website, because you know that's going to be a really slow path to achieving the kind of impact that we want to see in terms of student learning outcomes. And it means that we do need to work with the policymakers John was describing, figuring out who are the people who've got the power and leverage. The policymakers, the departments of education, they are often the place that teachers look to for guidance about what they're doing. So we've got to make sure that even though our audience is teachers, that we're engaging with the policymakers at the same time to ensure that we're all on message. We're not confusing everybody by them saying teachers do this and us saying teachers do something differently. So a bunch of things need to happen. And the most critical one of all is people need time. They need to be given time in the work that they're doing in order to engage with the change. And arguably there are a whole lot of other things you'd like to see happen as well. But the biggest challenge has been the sense that, oh, great, yet some other experts in ivory towers here to tell us what we're getting wrong. We've really got to work hard to make sure that we're seen as trusted and credible and offering something that is going to help solve problems for people.
Thank you, Jenny. That's great. And thanks, John, for your insights. Robin, lots of themes there on some of the challenges. What would you pull out as particular threads?
I just want to do a shout out to Tom Jefford there. Nothing like sticking with things that work to be innovative, Tom. So I enjoy your comment in the chat very much, and I hope you're doing well. I would encourage, one of the things that really has drawn a number of us to an area of research called implementation science, which a number of people on this group are very, very familiar with, and in fact are already working with themselves, is we are learning more and more about barriers that maybe we didn't think of, right? So I'm going to call out some very good research of a very good colleague of ours who was studying how to scale up, and the loose definition of scaling, loose, and I mean loose, is getting to about 70% of the intended population that could benefit from the innovation. So 70%, that's quite an effort, which means you know where your intended group is, you know who they are, and you're really focusing on making sure that you are able to achieve that. One of the things that, and most implementation research is open source, is a number of people around the world are systematically trying to assess and understand barriers and then build implementation plans to overcome them, right? And then share that knowledge, so we're learning. So Renard's work, Renard Badice, she studied what affected the scaling of a very well-known innovation for mental health in a number of states in the US. And when she looked at what was getting in the way and what was helping implement it, the culture of the organization stood out as one of the key findings that was a barrier to implementing. Now, had she not, as a research team, systematically tried to look for barriers and facilitators, she may have missed that. And so there is this great bunch of tools and approaches and knowledge and science that's being built, helping us really understand those barriers that John was referring to and that Jenny were referring to, but also encouraging us to possibly look for things we hadn't thought of. And then targeting our effort. And it's just like, I was trained as a psychologist a very, very long time ago. I'm not a registered psych anymore. And one of the things I was taught was you conduct an assessment and then you design your intervention approach based on what that assessment is. This is a very similar approach. One thing that we see often when we're working with groups to think about what is facilitating and what are common barriers to implementing are things like relative advantage, which Jenny and John were both getting at before. When being asked to implement a new innovation, or being told to, or trying to be convinced to, or whatever that is, to Jenny's point, being asked to stop doing something and do something else, if that human doesn't believe that new thing's better than the thing that they were doing before, it's very, very, very difficult. No matter how good your implementation plan, your training, your coaching, your infrastructure is, no matter how good it is, it's very difficult to get movement. And again, it goes to both points they were making before. So knowing that up front, that you have an issue around relative advantage, helps you target a little bit more where your effort should be to sort of better support implementing. The second thing I'd say is, for a very long time, in all the countries that we all work in, the main way that we've been trying to implement is by targeting the front line. So whether it be teachers, whether it be police, whether it be social workers, whether it be psychs, whether it be GPs, that's useful, but has been shown to be insufficient. And so John got at some points before about other things to think about. Jenny was getting at some points, but systematically thinking about not only what needs to go in place to support change at the front line, but also what needs to happen at an organizational level, and what needs to happen at a wider system level, and coming at all three of those things. So again, I'll also reference David Chambers' work here. Everybody knows how much we love the 3 eggs. It's a terrible name, the dynamic sustainability model. It makes it sound really boring and hideous. Go and have a look at it, because it really helps articulate why you need to come at various levels of the system at the same time with strategies to try and affect change. Because trying to change the front line without, or build on what the front line are doing, without changing the things, the systems and the structures behind them, almost reinforcing that to continue, is insane and has been shown to not really work. So those are the two other sort of additional comments. And again, there's this great body of research that's just accelerated. A book chapter myself and a few colleagues did, really showed the kind of upward curve of publications in these areas, and publications in all sorts of places, not just academic journals, that can kind of really help us all think through not only the what in terms of the evidence, but the how. And sometimes the how is almost more important than the what, you know. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Robin, and some fabulous things coming up in the chat. Great resources that are being shared, so do have a look at that, as well as some insights from some of our colleagues who've been doing this work for years, talking about how what they found to be effective in terms of their own implementation approaches. Oh, I love this one. Culture will eat strategy for breakfast. Yes, it's absolutely true. And I suppose before we move to our Q&A, I just thought we'd do one last round of some responses from the panel on how will you know that you've gotten there? Like, what does success look like for your organization? And how do you think about measuring impact? So this is one of the things that we think about a lot. I think a lot of what work centers and evidence intermediaries think about a lot is that we're in between. We operate in between between delivery and research, between research and practice. Given that we operate in this in-between space, we're dispensable, right? And I think understanding that we really need to be delivering value, but also able to articulate the impact that we've had in the world as an important consideration. So I'd like to throw to Jenny first to talk about how you're thinking about what success looks like, and then how you think about assessing that. And then we'll go to you, John, and finally to you, Robin.
It's both a really simple and a really hard question. For us, success is improved student learning and excellence and equity and education achievement. The vision statement is the statement of the success that we're aiming for. But evaluating our own impact in getting us there is really tricky. Even if we did, in 5 years, come to the top of the PISA rankings and conquer the world, it'd be a bit of a stretch to say, and it's all because we had Aero. Good on us. So the evaluation of impact is the question I'm really interested in trying to unpack for ourselves at the moment. You can look for the lead indicators, but to be honest, as I said at the beginning, having stuff on a website that people download, number of hits on your website, it's not a story of impact. It's not telling us whether or not anybody's actually using the stuff or whether that's changing anything for the students in a given classroom. So we're looking for some of the other things that are lead indicators to suggest we're on the right path. Ways to judge whether or not we are building the trust and credibility that we want to have in the education community, the kind of access and influence that we have on departments and senior policymakers, the evidence that we can see of the ways that our advice and analysis is informing decisions that are taken at a system level. So there are a number of other things that we're looking for, but it is really, really hard to do this. In that work that we did at the beginning, looking at other what works agencies, evidence agencies, etc., there was a lot of stopping at, well, we count hits on a website. I don't think it's an area that anybody has necessarily really nailed. So we're experimenting a little bit with the kinds of measures that we might apply to our own efforts. But the bottom line is impact's always got to be about student learning. That's what we're here for, improve student learning.
Thanks for that, Jenny. How about you, John? How do you think about success? How do you measure it?
I think this is hard. I mean, the theory of change for YEF, Youth Endowment Fund, is basically create knowledge or make it accessible, build influence, drive change, reduce youth violence. Now, for each of those, you can have metrics. So let me sort of give the positive side and then the problem. So on creating knowledge, you can measure, how many evaluations have you completed that came up with results that didn't go wrong. You can measure on influence. You can measure, how many people are actually reading what you're producing, especially if it's online, easy to do. What sort of credibility do you have? On change, you can measure, look, how much money have we redirected if it's a change of government policy and you believe you can tie it back to what you've done, especially if it's mandated to something you've produced, or of the key recommendations that you've put yourself behind, how many of them have been enacted to some degree. And then on youth violence, you can track that. The hardest bit, the bit that really matters, was the bit about change. And that was the bit, as I probably said it, you sort of thought, well, how can you be certain that that money was because of what you did? Or how can you be certain that those changes happened because of you? And so the bit that you most care about is the bit that's most subjective in the measurement. And so I don't think there's a way around that. I think you need to measure it and report on it, but not place, but be sort of aware of the weaknesses in it. The danger is otherwise, I think you put your weight on either the inputs or the ultimate outcome, which you can't necessarily claim was down to you. And so I think that's the challenge.
Interesting. Thanks, John. And how about Robin? Any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, and this question has been kicked around for as long as I've been involved in the evidence implementation area. I can remember conferences like 15 years ago where people were trying to figure that out. And I think some people here are were part of those conversations. I think, again, I think we need to be brave. Everybody's worried about trying to tackle attribution and or think about contribution, because it's not all up to one. Like, Jenny, you're amazing and Arrow's amazing, but it's going to take you and an army of people to pull this off, right? And Arrow and an army of partners, and everybody's heard me say this 100 times, and you're going to get so bored with this, but implementation is a team sport, full stop. So YF, same, it is you and an army of people thinking about how we're working together as teams to do this. I think also most of the reform efforts or the implementation efforts we're working in, people don't mind this collecting the data that you've both referenced, the website hits and the downloads and all. That's okay, we can do. When you start talking about collecting implementation outcomes and service and people outcomes, or even people outcomes, that's where people start to get a little bit worried. Well, we're a bit too far back. We can't quite, we're not close enough to the direct line. We wouldn't be able to affect that. And again, there's some really clever and innovative work around measurement that can help us all with our thinking on this. And one of it is actually looking for evidence of uptake and implementation, actual evidence. There's this great study. People have also heard me say this again, but I'm going to pick on my own training, so psychs, where they went around all these psychs and they said, over 400 of them, what are you implementing in terms of treating drug and alcohol issues? And this big sample of them all said motivational interviewing, which is a very well evidenced strategy for helping adults change behavior. When the people went around and observed what the psychs were doing, this is a published study, 3% to 5% were doing anything vaguely that looked like actual motivational interviewing that is shown to get the effect. So a lot of people will say that they're doing something. I will say that I'm doing something. But what we really need to crack is basically similar to what industry's done, similar to what agriculture's done, similar to what business has done. Some, again, really pragmatic way of measuring, is their uptake and implementation actually happening? And if so, what's really helping that? And if not, how can we overcome the barriers? And I think it goes to your point, John, on change. There's something that we all need to kind of work together to make it okay to look for use of things, changes in behavior, a change in the way the system's working. And if it's not working, that's okay. We just look for another way to measure it. But in our experience, it's the bit that people are more worried, either find it harder to kind of collect data on, or are more worried about it because they, especially evidence intermediaries, feel too far back. And I think we should stop that, because if we're going to continue to say we're too far back, then poor old service delivery that's underfunded chronically, that could use an army of 10 more frontline practitioners. How do we justify the spend of the money over here versus there? So I think we can crack it. It's just working together and finding a couple of, maybe local sites to try it. The reason why I think a lot of groups are very attracted to the very sort of structured, manualized, evidence-based programs, both in youth violence right through to education, is because a lot of the very considered developers figured out how to measure implementation and outcome and then provide that to them, right? Whereas when we start getting with messier stuff that doesn't come with those structures and those data points in mind, it can be a bit harder, I think. So I think we can do it.
Thank you. So do I. And I'm going to start moving to some of the Q&A from the audience. So we've got some fabulous questions coming in from the audience. I've got a couple up my sleeve, but if there are any that the panelists have seen come in that you have a burning desire to respond to, you can feel free to jump in on one of those. I'm going to start. I'd like to get in the last couple of minutes that we have to the really questions of kind of like the how. As someone who's running an evidence center, how are you thinking about particular aspects of work? Because I think that's one of the things, like there's a lot of theory out there, there's a lot of papers out there that talk in general about how we should do things, but really when it comes down to how you're putting things into practice, there's some key questions. So I have first a question on, I'd love this question on equitable research. I think both for John and for Jenny, you will be encountering this in different ways because of the populations that you are working with and addressing. And I think, so this question of how can What Works centers lean into more equitable research methods? Who decides what the best evidence is? And I would add to that, how do you ensure that you are appropriately representing the diverse populations that you are charged with supporting in your work, particularly when we know that the global evidence space is often skewed toward folks who aren't as well represented in the research. And so Jenny, I'd like to go to you first. I know you thought a lot about this question, and John, I'd like to pick up with you in a minute.
I think it goes back to the point that was made earlier about making sure that you're thinking about implementation right from the very beginning of the work. So, and it was a trap we started to fall into at the start. Wouldn't it be interesting to do this piece of analysis and then we'll know something that nobody ever knew before? Well, yes, it would, but what's the story about how that's going to change practice? So where does it go next? And baking in from the outset the implications of that new bit of knowledge, that new evidence base to what we expect to see in terms of change practice. And that means really understanding what is the problem that we're trying to solve, who needs to be part of it with us, who needs to be helping us frame the questions in the first instance, and who is with us designing the kinds of products that will follow as a result. A particular area where we have been spending a lot of time is thinking about the research governance that we build around projects that we do that are about Aboriginal students or teachers, making sure that we don't fall into the trap of doing research about them that isn't with them. Ideally, the research that we do that involves Aboriginal people ought to be also co-designed with Aboriginal people and ideally led by Aboriginal people. So it's really informed our thinking about the way we go about all our work from the outset. We don't just come up with a terrific thought bubble and think, oh yes, this would be really great to know. We'll grab that data set and we'll know something better. We think about it in terms of who is it for and how is it going to affect the practice on the ground and design it around that.
That's great. Thanks, Jenny. And I know this came up a bit in the research that we did with your team, was looking at how that one of the observations of the first decade of What Works centers is really that there may have been too narrow a definition about what we think about evidence as, and that it may have shut out some forms of evidence that would be based on community insight. And so I think that's an interesting corollary to what you're talking about.
We did spend a little bit of time at the outset. One of the very early things we published was our standards of evidence, because we wanted to go out early with an explanation of how we're interpreting this. We didn't want to publish the pyramid, you know, the hierarchy whereby if it's not RCT, doesn't meet our gold standard and it's dead to us. Instead, we went out saying, actually, teachers and early childhood educators are surrounded by evidence all the time. They work with it continually on a daily basis. Every time a teacher asks a student a question, they're collecting evidence. They know something they didn't know before about what that student already knows. So we've got a version of evidence which is very encompassing and doesn't make teachers think that this whole conversation is something that's not meaningful for them or doesn't mean anything to them. It's happening in a separate, more academic space that's not about them. We've identified standards of evidence on the basis of what level of confidence can you have with evidence of this nature. So if you've got really high stakes decisions to make, maybe you do want to be looking for the RCT. But if your question or the decision that you're trying to make is a lower stakes question, then other sources of evidence are perfectly acceptable for that context.
And how about you, John? How are you thinking about this question of equitable research methods and representation of the communities you work with in your research?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So, I mean, in the UK, the issue of youth violence brings with it a history of disproportionality, particularly for Black British people and particularly Black boys. And so it's really necessary for anyone who cares about the mission I outlined to get this stuff right. I think there's probably four main things for us. So one is who's on the team. So the makeup of the governance board that we have, the grants and evaluation committee that we have, my leadership team, the wider team, that's changed quite a lot over the last 2.5 years to make sure it is it actually disproportionately represents communities of colour. The second is, and within that is then the evaluators. And this is much harder for us, but we always are pushing our evaluators to make sure they're hiring or have in their team people of colour. The third is then internal challenge. So we have an advisory group of Black-led organisations who I meet with quarterly, and an internal staff team, staff group, race, equity, diversity, inclusion group, who review any papers they want to that come to the leadership team. And we also have a youth advisory board that does the same thing without abdicating responsibility. Decision making sits with the governance structure. We own it. We need to be held to account, but we should have challenge. And then what are we evaluating? So every round we do will include an organisation that is a Black or ethnic minority led organisation. But we mustn't give up on scale, because if we don't get scale in what we're evaluating, we can't actually pick up the differential outcomes of what's being delivered. And then finally, mixed methods. Like I will always stand up and say, look, I want to hold adults to account for what they do to children. And so therefore I want to do RCTs, because I think that's the right way to actually understand what's happening. But there's lots of things that you need to know that you can't get from an RCT, and lots of things can't be RCTable. And so making sure our staff have regular interactions with young people, and that we include people's experience of the criminal justice system that comes through anecdotal story and qualitative research in our thinking is really important.
Great, thank you. Now I'm conscious of time. I'm going to throw to you, Robin, for the last word. I know we only have about 2 minutes left, and we need to save at least a minute for closing.
Yeah, I might leave it though, because we are down to 2 minutes. I'll just add to try and handle some of the things that both Jenny and John was saying. There has been, again, quite a bit of recent work, and we've shared some of it via our summits and various sort of platforms we share information on, around innovation and evaluation design that gets at outcome and implementation, that can try and tackle a couple of questions, because it's not so much about what is the right design, but it's about what questions do we want to answer, and therefore what is the right design for that. And so sometimes it may be an RCT, depending on that question. And sometimes it might be a version of a fancy thing called a hybrid, which gets a little bit of outcome, implementation and outcome. So I think it's important that we all just stick to our guns on what the question is, and then let people with really good evaluation experience figure out how to answer that as rigorously as they can. So we're contributing.
Thank you, Robin. Great note to end on. And I'm just sharing my screen again. Want to say in closing, thank you very much to Robin, to John, to Jenny for joining us today. We'll be sharing the recording of this webinar in our LinkedIn and via the EIS website and mail to newsletter subscribers. So please make sure you sign up to the newsletter. We'll also ensure that you are signed up to the EIS newsletter when you do sign up for the CEI newsletter. I also want to make you aware that we run regular events. So EIS will be running these regular virtual series webinars, but we also have a series of events through the Center for Holistic Initiatives in Learning and Development, which are focused on early years, and through the National University of Singapore Center for Behavioral and Implementation Science Interventions, which will be focused on behavioral and implementation science. So those happen about monthly. So you may be able to access wonderful webinars every 3 to 4 weeks. So hopefully we will see you at many more, and please do stay in touch so you hear about the upcoming Evidence and Implementation Summit. Thanks very much to our speakers for today for a really interesting discussion, and we will see you all at the next event.